Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Conflicts like the Russian war in Ukraine produce a horde of fake experts, confidently lecturing us about tactics, psychology, history, geopolitics, which town is strategic, who's in the inner circle. And they talk of grand ideological battles between good and evil, freedom and dictatorship, democracy and autocracy. We're flooded with images and information and emerge from it more ignorant. Behind it all, a unanimous chorus calling for escalation, led by the media. The voice of the rare actual expert is drowned out by this cacophony of braying and bloviating frauds. Thus, it's a pleasure and honor to discuss the terrible events of the last month with Anatol Lieven, a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, who spent decades reporting on the former Soviet Union, wrote the book Ukraine and Russia, A Fraternal Rivalry, covered Russia's war in Chechnya from both sides, and warned of the war that's now upon us. Anatol, welcome.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm so glad to have you on because you have some real expertise. I mean, we always hear, on TV, there's all these experts and pundits, but you actually can speak from a real place of expertise. So I guess a good place to start is, this seems like in so many ways a chronicle of a war foretold. And you warned that Russia might be pushed into doing this, as did American experts and officials since the 90s. So was Russia's invasion a surprise to you? And what do you think caused it?
It wasn't a surprise to me, no, because Russia had been accumulating these troops since November and clearly threatening to invade. But like the vast majority of experts, and including Russian experts, I thought it would be a much more limited operation. I didn't think that they would try to capture Kiev, partly because I didn't believe that their intelligence could be so extremely poor as it turned out to be, because they totally underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance. And after all, if there's one place that the Russian intelligence services should know about, it's Ukraine, right? So I think it really, emphasized the degree to which Putin had cut himself off from advice, from intelligence, really from we know that from the Bush administration before the Iraq War, right? Administrations that have made their mind up to do something simply filter out any information that doesn't accord with their prejudices. But I wasn't surprised by the invasion. Incidentally, another person rather more senior than me who clearly wasn't surprised by the invasion was Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, because he is one of those US diplomats, first policy planning in the 90s and then ambassador to Moscow, who warned successive American administrations repeatedly that Ukrainian NATO membership was an absolute Russian red line that would lead to deep crisis and possibly war. I think also, like many people, and this of course does come from the initial underestimation of the Ukrainians, but I've been struck by the degree of just sheer military incompetence with which Russia has waged this war. And I think that also does go back to what has become the nature of the Putin regime. Much narrower, much more closed. Especially since COVID, it seems that Putin really only relies on a group of perhaps half a dozen people.
Yeah, I've heard this from even people inside Russia as well, right? That it's like your inner circle becomes smaller and smaller, and you're increasingly surrounded by people who will just say yes, like yes men, who will say yes to everything that you say. And we do hear in the sort of prevailing thought, and particularly in the Western analysis, is that Russia is losing very, very badly. I mean, it was interesting because at first US intelligence even predicted that Russia would take Kiev in 72 hours. And now it's several weeks into it. So it is interesting. I think everyone on all sides is incredibly surprised by basically Russia's inability so far to take Ukraine. But at the same time, when we go back just a few months, if we hear a lot from American and British officials now saying that they never intended for Ukraine to join NATO, but then they wouldn't say it back then. If American and British, and they've been warning that this invasion was going to happen, right, for months and months and months. So if they thought this invasion was going to happen, and you had so many American officials, including, years ago, like you mentioned, Will Burns, but also Joe Biden, also others, in the past and even present, saying if, Ukraine, it's like the red line. Why does it seem as though the US and the British did so little to prevent this? Maybe I'm wrong to think that, but it seems like they didn't do very much to prevent it other than saying it was going to happen.
Well, the British didn't do anything because the British will never do anything that America doesn't allow them to do. You can discount, any serious role for London in all this. As far as America is concerned, I think the answer is cowardice. You see it in my own world. I have got very sick of being told by colleagues among Russian experts that of course everybody knew that Ukraine would not get into NATO, and a treaty of neutrality was almost practically really on offer. And I have to reply, I was one of the few people who actually came out in public and advocated it. Most of the experts didn't, because of course it would have made them a little bit unpopular in the Washington establishment. But I think that's true of the Biden administration as well, given the intensely polarized nature and totally American politics and totally cynical nature of the opposition. By the way, the Democrats, when in opposition, are just as bad. The Republicans would immediately have accused Biden of cowardice, of weakness, et cetera, et cetera. And the Biden administration was not prepared to take that domestic risk, even though, yes, if a treaty of neutrality had been offered before the war, it wouldn't have met all Russia's demands, but I think it would have, met enough of them to have prevented this war.
Yeah, it's incredible. If all it took was just saying Ukraine, literally, like the president of France and all of these American officials now and pundits are saying, oh yeah, like Ukraine, I don't know why Russia's being paranoid. Ukraine was never going to be a part of NATO. Like, why not just say that several months ago? And yeah, I guess cowardice would be one big part of it. But then from the Russian side of things, and we can only speculate, obviously, but why not just take Donbass? Why invade the entire country where much of the population is hostile towards Russia, particularly post 2014, and where the West has been preparing an insurgency? There's been reports about that for years. Surely the Russians knew about that.
Well, first of all, I think perhaps it's unfair to expect Russia to be less paranoid than the United States. And I don't know if you've been following, China is trying to develop a port in Central Africa, which could conceivably, although at present it's only a commercial port, at some point become a military port. And you've got all these pieces about America saying that China cannot be allowed to develop a base on the Atlantic Ocean because the Atlantic Ocean is America's backyard. This is a threat to vital American interests. We all know that the slightest appearance of another great power in Central America drives the Americans crazy, and they will, adopt the most ruthless methods to prevent this. So, the Russian establishment is just as paranoid, and I think they exaggerate the threat of NATO, but I think as well what they were hoping to do was, by getting a treaty of neutrality, to sort of show the Ukrainians that they had no chance of getting into NATO, they had no chance of getting into the European Union. Therefore, why not make a reasonable deal, with Russia, compromise with Russia? Of course, now the Russians have probably, at some stage in a peace settlement, got a treaty of neutrality. But from every other point of view, of course, they've lost Ukraine. They get to keep Crimea, undoubtedly, and probably most of the Donbass. But, because of what they've done, Ukraine, even if it's not in NATO, will move towards the West and will have much more support from the West to do so. So Russia has, in a way, I mean, Russia, if it goes on grinding away, it will take more territory. But I do think that politically speaking, Russia has already lost this war.
So you and others have said that the U.S. never had any intention, never had any intention of defending Ukraine, and it's obvious NATO, at least for now, will not take serious risks to defend Ukraine from this invasion. So if everybody, we already talked about everybody knew Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO, and NATO countries basically said as much. Why do you think? And I know you mentioned the paranoia, but why do you think I just want to elaborate on this a little bit. Why do you think the Russians were so worried? Is it because, as the Russians claim, NATO was placing weapons in Ukraine that targeted Russia and had essentially turned Ukraine into kind of like an unofficial member of NATO? Or do you think those concerns were exaggerated? Because when you do look at the military infrastructure, for example, of Ukraine, whether it was a member of NATO or not, it was seemingly being integrated with NATO. There were NATO military exercises taking place in Ukraine. There was a lot of training taking place. So, yeah, I guess, was that an exaggerated concern, or was that a fair concern for Russia to have?
Well, it was an exaggeration of the truth, if you like. I mean, not a threat to Russia, but certainly, the training and equipment of Ukrainian forces where what was preparing them possibly for an operation to attack and retake the Donbass, for example, and then basically to storm the Donbass and then face Russia with a fait accompli. The other issue is that, and once again, this is the kind of thing that the West really should have told the Ukrainians not to engage in. But for 2 years before the war, Ukraine has been blockading the water supply to Crimea. Now, look, you could say legally, fair enough, Russia illegally annexed Crimea. But the point is, it was doing tremendous damage to the Crimean economy and society. And, you don't, unless you are actually prepared for war, it is unwise to provoke a much stronger opponent in this way. That's one reason why Russia is insisting on recognition of Crimea as part of a peace agreement, in order that Ukraine should not be able to impose that kind of blockade again. I mean, there are ways around that, but I mean, certainly any peace settlement has to exclude, of course, future Russian military pressure on Ukraine, but it also has to exclude, Ukrainian attempts to force the return of these territories.
And then, I promise this will come back to Ukraine, but in the Syrian civil war, there was weapons and support that kept being supplied to Syrian insurgents, even when it became clear that the government of Syria was going to survive, especially after the Russian intervention on behalf of the Syrian government. And it seemed that the goal of this was to just simply make it more costly for Damascus and, at that point, Moscow, and to punish them for, I guess, winning the war, if we can call it winning. So to bring it back to Ukraine, now the West is flooding Ukraine with a pretty insane amount of weapons and, of course, punishing Russia with unprecedented sanctions. Yet there doesn't seem to be a Western rush to halt the war. So is this a similar scenario where the war is being prolonged and Ukrainians are being encouraged to basically die simply to weaken Russia and punish it?
Well, there is that element. Certainly, I mean, you read it openly, hardliners in Washington and also in certain parts of Europe. But I think, it's a mixture of things, because that goes together with, on the other hand, obviously genuine and justified outrage at what Russia has done, at the invasion, and a desire to help the Ukrainians. But this combination of, on the one hand, pretty ruthless, cynical geopolitical ambitions, on the part of America and certain allies, then with, moral fervor, which may be justified, but as people have said, is not necessarily the best guide to policy. I mean, yes, that risks, essentially putting Western policy on autopilot, and prolonging the war and ignoring or even blocking possibilities of of a peace settlement. Of course, the damage is not, obviously the greatest damage is to Ukraine, and obviously to Russia from sanctions. But as I'm sure you know very well, I mean, the wider repercussions of the war and sanctions on food prices, for example, in many parts of the world, because of the effect on wheat exports and the international price of wheat, risks being very severe indeed. There are warnings of first a European recession, then a global recession. So the risks of this war go far beyond Ukraine, which is another reason, in my view, why we should really try to push for a peace settlement, on terms that will guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty, if that seems possible, which I think it is becoming possible, because clearly, I mean, Russia is being gradually fought to a standstill and is suffering huge losses of men. So, and actually, I mean, you see, well, Russia has set out its terms, which are, I think, basically the terms that will have to be agreed in the end. Of course, there are many details that will have to be worked out and guarantees for Ukraine. But it seems to me that we do have a viable peace settlement now on the table, or the basis for it, and that it's the settlement that we could get today, or we could get in 10 years' time, and the only difference is how many people have died in the meantime.
So there's such a parallel to Syria there, which a lot of the same voices, by the way, that like their policies they're advocating, we must continue fighting, as opposed to finding a way to like decrease the amount of people who are going to die. Because you're right, the outcome is ultimately going to be the same at the end, regardless of how many people die. I wanted to move to the issue of Putin for a moment, because some have tried to psychoanalyze Putin and kind of return to the Kremlinology of the Cold War. And they've said that, he's gone completely crazy. But, in the past, he has, been pretty, I think at least, seemingly calculated and cautious in pursuit of what he sees as, his or Russia's interest, regardless of whether or not we agree with him or them. Like I mentioned, other Russian dissidents with whom I've spoken to have said that from their vantage point, this is a power move intended to cement his grip on power inside Russia at a time when there's growing dissent. I don't know if that's like maybe optimistic from a dissident point of view. But how do you explain Putin's motives? And, what do you think? I know it's hard because we don't have like real polling we can look to right now, but do you have an idea of how much support there is for him for this war at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Putin's a great power nationalist, and for Russia to be a great power in the world, it needs to have Ukraine as an ally or a neutral state. And there are, and then Putin has become. I noticed that when I went to a conference where he appeared back in October. It could be that age is beginning to play a part. He was clearly much more concerned with Russian history, with Russian and Ukrainian history, perhaps with his own historical role, as he gets older, maybe even beginning to think of stepping down and wanted to go out with a great, victory. It seems to me that is the basic reason, because if it were simply about his domestic popularity, yes, okay, he's got a boost from this war. But even if he didn't expect economic sanctions to be as severe as they have been, I talk to people in the Russian elites. They knew that if there was an invasion of Ukraine, there would be severe sanctions, and that this would, affect Russia badly. And I think that, in the longer term, not that, masses of people will come out, for surrender in Ukraine, as Russians would see it, or, or in favor of the West. But, if their living standards plummet, if they lose their jobs in large numbers, if inflation surges, well, then, that adds to a very widespread degree of anger among ordinary people at corruption in Russia, the corruption of the Putin regime and all the sort of petty oppressions and corruptions of Russian life. And I think with time, therefore the regime might be in serious trouble. At the moment, he certainly had a surge in popularity as a result of the war. Of course, this is also because of, really, really intensive state propaganda. He's established control over all the television channels now. There is no, public media dissent, except on the internet, where there's a lot. Of course, the other thing here, which one sees in so many societies, sees it in America, sees it in Britain, is what you could call the 70-30 divide in Russia. Only 30% of Russians have ever traveled outside Russia. And, they are the ones who, of course, are suffering themselves already from what's happened, and are also much more aware of the damage that this, will do to Russia, the Russian economy, Russia in the world. But of course, the 70% at the moment are more likely to think, oh, those damned elites in Moscow and Petersburg, why should we care if they can't buy Prada handbags, or go on holiday to Italy? So much the better, serve them right, So I think there is an element there of class and region which Putin has been able to exploit. But the other, of course, there are two things which I think he would have to worry about. One is obviously, economic decline and living standards, but the other is quite interesting. One reason, it seems, why the Russians simply deployed far too few troops for the operation that they planned. One, obviously, they underestimated the Ukrainians grossly, but it seems as well that the Russian government has tried as far as possible to use only professional, regular soldiers, volunteers in the front ranks, and that would seem to indicate that they are, really worried about the effects on Russian public opinion if large numbers of conscripts, come back dead. But at that point, if they go on suffering casualties at this rate, sooner or later they will have to call on conscripts in large numbers, which seems to me another reason why perhaps the Kremlin is now genuinely interested in a peace settlement. Though of course only they want one that they can present to the Russian people as some kind of victory.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. I'm wondering if we could shift for a moment to the issue of the role of the radical right in this conflict. We of course know that Russia has supported some right-wing movements in certain parts of Europe before this conflict, but we also know that since the coup in Ukraine and the ensuing civil war that started back in 2014, the Ukrainian extreme right has become the most organized and armed and influential of its kind in Europe. And the Russians, of course, have included denazification as one of their goals. And then, of course, Western media, which had once, shown a light on Ukrainian neo-Nazis, have now embraced all Ukrainians carrying weapons as defenders of freedom. And then, of course, Russia has its own right-wing problem, but maybe I'm too scarred by the civil war in Syria, but it does remind me of the Western embrace of the Syrian insurgency and really apologizing for its extremists until it became impossible to deny that Al-Qaeda and ISIS were the dominant factions. And I'm not suggesting that neo-Nazis are the dominant factions in Ukraine, but of course there are elements on the ground there that are fighting. So in your view, what is the role of the radical right or neo-Nazis, the Azov battalion, the Banderites, Ukrainian nationalists, whatever we want to call them? What is their role in the fighting today, and what are the risks in this?
Well, in terms of electoral support, these groups are very weak. The absolute maximum vote they got was 2012, when they got 11%, more or less. Now it's way down, in single figures, and so to say that Ukraine is Nazi, is obviously, rubbish. It's
Right.
pure lying Russian propaganda, and of course, one has to point out that President Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Jewish liberal. But I think the point is, though, that where these extreme rightist groups or their paramilitary wings, of course, have achieved disproportionate power, is on the streets, because they are the archetypal street fighters, so they can intimidate governments and other political parties, as they've done again and again with violent demonstrations. But secondly, by fighting, and fighting very hard. There's no doubt about their courage and commitment for years now in the Donbass, and now in Mariupol. The Mariupol is the center of the Azov regiment, and indeed they are fighting to the death there, and that of course gives them a disproportionate potential influence after the war. If you remember how after the First World War, associations of ex-servicemen, made up of former frontline troops and especially elite troops, played a disastrous role in Europe, in Italy, in Germany, and elsewhere. I think this is something that we need to worry about.
Right, and I just want to say one thing about Zelensky. I don't know if it's still appropriate to. Well, I don't know if it's appropriate to necessarily call him a liberal, only because, and maybe I think some of this was obviously responding to those far right elements in the street, because he did try in the beginning to be sort of like this peace person who wanted to bring the country together, but then he was banning opposition media even before the war, and banning his opponents, in fact. So it's, I just take a little bit of issue, I guess, with Ukraine. Not that it's not okay to invade a country or violate its sovereignty in any way, but the idea that Ukraine is sort of this bastion of like liberal democracy, when it's just, it actually has a lot in common with Russia in many ways, in that respect. But I'll leave that there.
Just one thing which should be said is that one area in which the Ukrainians were totally wrong, and the West was totally wrong not to criticize them for this, was in their laws discriminating against the Russian language in Ukraine. And one big question for Ukraine after the war is precisely who will have the ascendancy. The extreme nationalists, who want to continue that policy, or Zelensky has now suggested that actually these laws could be cancelled, if only, of course, because the Russian-speaking population of the East and South has has on the whole demonstrated its loyalty to Ukraine. So I'm very, irrespective of Russia's demands, this is an offer that Kiev should be making in any case. But such an offer would certainly be bitterly unpopular with Azov and the other, extreme.
Well, no, I think there's something to be said about Russia invading Ukraine actually causing, I think, this issue with like anti-Russian sentiment and the problems with the far right to be even worse, actually making the problem worse. You already see it's making the country, whatever liberalism it might have had, less liberal. You have Zelensky now banning all of these parties, calling them pro-Russia. I think one of them is like the second most popular party in Ukraine that got a big chunk of the vote in the last election in parliament. And so, yeah, the repercussions of this war are going to cause a threat to, I guess, it's going to cause a problem across Ukrainian society for a long time to come. But again, not looking only at Syria, but also at, Afghanistan or the former Yugoslavia. We have seen real dangers from flooding countries with weapons and fighters. And I assume that many of the weapons coming into Ukraine are probably not being used to target Russians right away, but are being stored away to be maybe sold on the black market at some point. That's what happens with this kind of situation. And, how after this is over, another threat is like, how will you demobilize these well-armed militias in a country that was already one of the most corrupted, and like a mafia type system has dominated the country. And now we have thousands of men from Europe, from America, rushing in to volunteer and fight. It just seems like a recipe for disaster, and then like perhaps a long-term threat to the world. Like, what do you see as being the long-term repercussions of this, especially if it continues for years to come, as we're hearing some people say?
Well, I mean, this is a really vivid thing for me, but because I covered Afghanistan, in the 80s, and one saw exactly this after the fall of the communists. The Mujahideen turned on each other. But I also, as you mentioned, covered the Chechen war in the mid 90s, and a key reason for the subsequent catastrophe was precisely that there were all these brutalized, militarized, unemployed, heavily armed young men left behind in a desolated economic landscape. So I suppose, part of the question is, after this war is finished, whenever it is, whether the West and Europe will really give solid support to reconstruction and development in Ukraine. Because it has to be said, up to the war, American economic aid to Ukraine was pathetic. Pathetic. And the combination of that with all the language of Ukraine as a vital partner and so forth was contemptible, frankly. So we have to see whether this European Western generosity continues after the war. But yes, you're absolutely right. The key question, will the war bring Ukrainians together behind a really determined program of reform, anti-corruption, democratization, civic nationalism for all Ukrainians, not just ethnic Ukrainians, or will the hard men? By the way, the Ukrainian extreme nationalists, do indeed have close links in several cases to organized crime. Will they be, the ones who will dominate? One cannot say. I think all that one can say with some confidence is that the longer the war goes on, the more, almost by definition, likely it is that the hard men will gain in power and prestige, because you do have to recognize, as the defense of Mariupol is showing, that whatever else they are brave and committed fighters. But then, as you know too well from the Middle East, the bravest and committed fighters are not the best Democrats or the best people for the future of the country, right?
No, typically not, of course. Like they're usually the most ideologically committed to some extreme form of this or that. The Russians have also, you mentioned your coverage of Chechnya. The Russians have also dispatched Chechen fighters to Ukraine. And I'm curious, do you think that that's significant in any way? Why do you think they did this?
Well, I think it is also because, once again, they're running short of professional troops, and the Chechens are notoriously good fighters. But on the other hand, this seems to me, if it turns into a long war, a really dangerous move from Putin's point of view, because your ordinary Russian soldier or junior officer doesn't much like Chechens, and seeing Chechen troops possibly committing atrocities in southern Ukraine against people in southern and eastern Ukraine who are actually in so many cases ethnic Russians, that could have a disastrous effect on Russian military morale. And if those stories started filtering back into Russia, even people who now support the war might start saying, no, we can't stand for this.
Yeah, it also seems to be in some way exacerbating or maybe exciting the sort of far right elements in Ukraine who are very happily expressing, oh, we're gonna wrap these dead Chechen fighters in pig's skin so that they don't go to heaven. So there's that element of it too. It seems to be like giving almost like red meat to those people as well.
Well, and neo-Nazis in Western Europe as well, who are
Right.
beginning to volunteer for the Ukrainian cause. And yes, sometimes they're ex-soldiers and adventurers and mercenaries, but some of them also do seem, in their darkened minds, to think this is part of the great battle against Islam.
Right. Against Russia. They actually do though. The neo-Nazi viewpoint on this is like Russians aren't even actually Slavic. They're like Mongols. They don't even that they're descendants of Mongols. I think that's like the sort of rhetoric that I see flying around from that crowd. But if we could go back in time for a bit, because this is never talked about in the prevailing narrative about this war. How responsible is the US, or maybe it's more appropriate to say US-backed NGOs, for the 2014 overthrow of the Ukrainian government. How much has the US been interfering in Ukraine since then? You know, Russia calls the Ukrainian government a puppet government. And then the US and Western countries respond by denying any role in influencing or interfering in it. But we know that's not true given the leaked Victoria Nuland call back in those days. But who's right here?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, the uprising, the protests on the streets of Kiev began as genuinely popular protests, and you know, not only from Ukraine extreme nationalists, but from, you know, much wider sections of youth, and I think, you know, you have to recognize that is because they rejected the idea of Ukraine joining the Russian-led Eurasian Union, and for very understandable reasons, you know, preferred to try to move, you know, towards the European Union, because for them, you know, the Eurasian Union, you know, they sort of tied it not altogether fairly, but in their own minds, with all the things that they disliked within Ukraine, you know, corruption, misgovernment, backwardness, authoritarianism. So I think, you know, the impetus to try to move towards the West was a genuine one. But then, you know, to some extent, this was taken over, at least in terms of street fighting, by these extreme nationalist groups, you know, because they are the tough guys, you know, they are and they had been really preparing, as their own leaders have said, they've been preparing for this moment for many, many years. And then, I mean, how far and I mean, you know, of course, Western NGOs were, I mean, openly feeding and supplying the demonstrators. I mean, you know, I don't think they were directly supplying the extreme right, but so you know, but they sort of supported the general movement. Towards the end, it's not clear to what extent America orchestrated the final, you know, armed overthrow of President Yanukovych, which of course overthrew also a deal which Russia, America, and the European Union had reached, perfectly good deal, which is Yanukovych, you know, remains temporarily in power, but you have early elections to decide, you know, what the mass of the Ukrainian people want. You do have to remember that, you know, that the armed overthrow of Yanukovych destroyed this diplomatic agreement, which was also a democratic solution. And so, and then whether America backed that overthrow is not clear. What is certainly true is that America accepted it, tried to orchestrate it subsequently, as you say, the famous telephone call by Nuland, to make sure that you know, that you got a pro-American government in place, and did nothing at that stage to preserve democracy in Ukraine. So, you know, Russia has legitimate grounds for complaint about that. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting going forward too. I mean, obviously you can't say that the Zelensky government is like a coup government because they were actually elected to power. But at the same time, it's, you know, it's curious, like how much is what the Ukrainian leadership says based on what, you know, they're sort of, are they scheming with the Europeans or the Americans, or what is the Americans saying to them, or what's NATO saying to them that's making them feel, you know, empowered or emboldened enough to like refuse, you know, to refuse neutrality, at least in the past, or to like, you know, do these provocative things, like you said, blocking the water with Crimea. It stands to be seen. I mean, maybe one day we'll have WikiLeaks cables showing us just how much, you know, people were talking to each other. But there are, of course, attempts to mediate this conflict made by what I think at least are unconventional players like China, Turkey. You know, we even saw an attempt by the Israelis. How serious do you think these efforts are? And you've written about this. So how do you think this conflict might end?
Well, it's I know this must sound extremely odd to anyone in the Middle East, but it does seem to me that the Israelis probably have the best chance.
Oh,
Simply,
really?
well, simply, you see, because they're trusted by all the three main players, which are the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the Americans. Whereas the Chinese and the Turks, even if they manage to measure of success mediating between the Russians and the Ukrainians, would face intense hostility and suspicion in Washington, which I think would instinctively, then try to spoil any agreement reached. We've seen that in the Middle East as well, right? When somebody tries to take a peace process out of the hands of the Americans. But I think that potentially the Israelis could play a positive role if with America's say so. As to the terms, well, the broad outline, except in one case, is on the table already. It's the details, which are the killers, which have to be worked out. That is a treaty of neutrality. Zelensky has basically offered that, with guarantees for Ukrainian security. What that would consist of, we're not quite sure, but I mean, one can imagine that, and there would have to be reciprocal things about Ukraine once again not blockading Crimea. Demilitarization, Russia has suggested, or Russian officials have suggested, that could simply mean certain categories of missiles, and no foreign military bases on Ukrainian soil. So that could be folded into neutrality. Denazification, as originally phrased, I mean, difficult to imagine the Ukrainian government agreeing basically to launch a civil war against its own extremists. But perhaps if the Ukrainians, as by the way, Zelensky is also, so much of this is about, suggestions which are sometimes subsequently denied and then come out in a new form, but that Ukraine could cancel these laws discriminating against the Russian language in Ukraine in recent years. That might go far enough for that. Then there's the territorial issue. Now there, I mean, the Ukrainians are never going to get Crimea back. If this war goes on for 100 years, they still won't get Crimea back unless Russia actually completely collapses as a state. So perhaps the way out, as various people, including myself, have suggested, as by the way Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, has suggested, is a second referendum under United Nations supervision to legitimize this. And then there's the Donbass. Now there, the problem is that, Russia doesn't yet, even why they're trying to storm Mariupol, doesn't yet actually control all the territory that it claims for the separatist Donbass republics, though it will probably be able to conquer that in the next couple of weeks. Difficult to imagine Ukraine giving up more territory than it held at the beginning of the war, but possibly, I mean, if both sides really want to make peace, there are ways around this. One is that you could have a referendum in the Donbass on a district by district basis. In other words, not the province as a whole voting, but every individual district within the province votes on whether it wants to be part of Ukraine or separate. Well, there one can well imagine that the line might run very close to the previous ceasefire line, since I don't imagine that Russian shells and bombs have gained many supporters for Russia in the places that they're attacking. Nor, by the way, on the side of the separatist republics, this is being completely ignored by the Western media. But the Ukrainians have been, intensively shelling across the border into those places. So they, I'm sure, will want to stay, with Russia. I mean, alternatively, Russia is, unlike Crimea, Russia has not annexed these areas. It's recognized their independence. So you could have, if the will is there, you could have these republics say, "Oh, we return to the Minsk process. We will try to negotiate a confederal arrangement, power sharing with Ukraine." I don't think that would lead to anything, But if the intention is to try to end the war and kick things into the diplomatic long grass, then that could be a way out. So I think there are actually ways out of this conflict now, which would allow Putin to present it as a success, and would not actually cost Ukraine anything in real terms, because whether it's NATO membership or rule over Crimea, it's actually lost these already. But of course, politically, it's difficult for Zelensky, and there will be tremendous pushback by the Ukrainian extreme nationalists. That is why, of course, Zelensky needs the full support of the United States and of Europe in negotiating such a peace. And that is why, these American hardliners who want to, and they're talking about it quite openly, to turn Ukraine into Afghanistan and to bleed, weaken, and even destroy Russia, are so appallingly dangerous, because they could be in a position to block a peace settlement, just by not helping Zelensky.
Yeah, I mean, it really is just stunning to see how these people that claim to care about Ukraine so much are more than happy to watch it become just like, whatever Afghanistan became, which is just this sort of like post-apocalyptic hellscape after endless war because of a nonstop insurgency you continue to support. But just real quick to shift to the sort of damage to Russia and the rest of the world, the sanctions imposed on Russia seem so severe, in a way that the country's kind of being punished the way that Germany was punished after World War I. So what do you think will be the consequences for Russia of these sanctions? And then likewise, the consequences for Europe, which isn't really being talked about as much, but the consequences are there. And then, of course, the rest of the world, which you alluded to before, the consequences of losing access to Russia.
Well, I mean, the Russian economy is in itself pretty small. But, I mean, there are 3 points of vulnerability. One is international food prices, as part of wider inflation in parts of the world and in the United States itself. The US has seen, very high levels of inflation, historically speaking, over the past year. So that's the first one, and the risk of food crises in various parts of the world and political instability. The other is obviously energy prices. They haven't gone up as much as people feared. That's partly because, of course, the Europeans have very carefully excluded gas from their sanctions because they depend on it. But obviously, it's led to rises and volatility. And the third is, international financial markets if Russia defaults. And, as has been pointed out, the seizure of Russia's international debt, has sent some really worrying signals to a number of countries, above all China. I would expect the Chinese to start, I mean, it will take them time, but really trying to move out of, American bonds in particular, simply for fear that they will be seized in any future crisis. Now, that risks really considerable instability on world financial markets and a drop in confidence. Now, if you put those 3 things together, in circumstances where, due to COVID, the international economy was already pretty shaky, I mean, that does look to me, very, very dangerous. And one hopes that when Biden is in Europe later this week, that some of the calmer European leaders will try to bring this home to him. I mean, it could be that the CIA station chiefs in the Middle East are saying the same thing as well. But just at the moment, between geopolitical ambition, what one has to call sheer hatred of Russia from a variety of sources, some of them legitimate, in view of the war, and then American, the Europeans are just the same. But I mean, this tremendous moralizing, which is, look, it's quite legitimate as far as it goes, given the invasion of Ukraine. But of course, as certain people are pointing out, when it comes to American behavior over the past 20 years, kettles calling pots black is, a mild way of describing present American attitudes. But if you put these, all of this together, you have a very, very hysterical mood, in Washington, especially at the moment.
Yeah, it's quite frightening. And it's all this sort of like conformist group think where there's no space, probably for someone like you or your colleagues at Quincy to really have a voice on this issue. And then it's interesting, I'm talking to you from the Middle East, a part of the world that is very familiar with American policy and its repercussions. I think it's interesting when you look around, we talk about the international community and the international community condemning Russia. It's really just the US, Europe, Australia, Japan. You really can't say it's the world, because a huge chunk of the world, Latin America, much of Asia, much of what we call the Middle East, much of all of most of Africa, are really abstaining from taking a side in this conflict. And I'm curious, why.
This is an improvement on normal American behavior. Very often, according to America, the international community consists of America, Britain, and the Marshall Islands. Oh, and Israel, of course.
That's right, of course. In fact, this time Israel isn't a part of the international community.
The international community is a very flexible concept as far as Washington is concerned.
Exactly. But it is interesting watching such, big countries like, India and Brazil, which are close allies of the US. They don't want to condemn Russia. Countries of all across the ideological spectrum. It's not just Cuba and Venezuela, and sort of like the typical countries that are in Russia's or that are allied with Russia. It's way more Saudi Arabia, the UAE. These are client states of America. So why do you think so much of the world is abstaining from joining the West in isolating Russia?
Well, I think partly it's, it is this sense of double standards. We just do not accept America's right to dictate to us, what is moral and what is not, given America's record. But I think the point is also that, all of these countries are dedicated to their own national interests. And, in the case of India, Indians, however much they may want an alliance with America or a partnership with America, have always, when speaking to me, been absolutely categorical that this is an alliance of equals. This is not an alliance in which America dictates to us, and this is an alliance in which we will always defend what we see as our national interests. In other words, as one senior Indian diplomat said to me, we're not Denmark. We are not simply going to obey American orders. He was kind enough not to say we're not Britain, speaking to a Brit. And yeah, I mean, we want cooperation with America when it's in our interest, but when it's not in our interest, no. And clearly, I mean, in the case of Russia, because of all the wider economic fears that I've expressed, they do not think it is in their national interest to condemn Russia and to join in sanctions. And I think also, I mean, there is a very widespread feeling that it's not. I think it's not that people want to support the Russian invasion or justify the invasion as such, but I think unlike in the West, there is much more of a recognition that U.S. and Western actions did contribute unnecessarily to the crisis that led to the war. I mean, right. Certainly, if anyone attempted to ring India with an alliance of states bitterly hostile to India, you would see very, very strong pushback by India. Even much more limited Chinese, arrival in South Asia has produced a very, very strong Indian reaction. So, they have more of an understanding of well, should we say, geopolitical realities, I think, because frankly, a much more toughly realist one and a less. Right. I mean, if one were unsympathetic, you could say it was less moral. If you were more sympathetic, you'd simply say it was less hypocritical. Take your choice.
Well, I also think, there's like kind of fairy tales that are told that we tell ourselves in the West about good and bad and, democracy versus authoritarian and this kind of like worldwide struggle that when it comes down to it, just, there is much more of a realistic perspective from countries that are outside of that bubble. I agree. And I also wonder too, if you look at the past few years, I mean, if you're an ally of America, a very close one, and you're watching Afghanistan, where the U.S. just kind of left the people that it was propping up for 20 years in the cold, and then you're watching the U.S. really, as much as this has maybe emboldened or made NATO feel empowered, or it's also just showing NATO's weakness because they're not intervening, at least not directly, because they don't want to start a third world war. So Ukraine has, in many ways, been abandoned despite all of the weapons being, showered into it. So in a way, if you're a U.S. ally, you're kind of, I think, also watching that maybe the U.S. isn't going to stick by me if, it comes to be our turn. And so maybe it is better to not isolate Russia and to keep our options open about these sort of big players that we can be allied with, But speaking of NATO, NATO was this military alliance, I think, in search of a purpose ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. Do you think this war has ironically justified their existence or even empowered this body? And what are the risks of that?
I think it has. I think this is a dream for NATO, frankly. It's a paradise because, on the one hand, it gives them their old enemy. But on the other hand, they're not going to fight. Whereas, of course, in this search for other purposes, after the Cold War, they found themselves in situations where they did have to fight, and they were very, very bad at it, and their populations refused to support them. I mean, it's very striking, the French, and look, I'm not going to take sides on French behavior in Africa, but the French have been begging for European and NATO help in West Africa for years now. And the response has been absolutely pathetic because there, of course, you do have to fight. And there are deep moral, or from the European point of view, ambiguities about supporting dictatorships and so forth and so on. So this, in a way, is absolutely perfect. It's the purpose for which NATO was created, containing Russia. But it goes back to the Cold War because other people are doing the dying. NATO is not going to fight Russia, and barring some horrible accident, Russia is not going to fight NATO. After what's happened in Ukraine, the whole idea of Russia invading NATO, is a fantasy so absurd it surprises me that even a general could believe in it. But from NATO's point of view, it's perfect. And of course, from the European point of view, yes, they have to expand their militaries, but on the other hand, America is right back in, to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. So yes, I mean, after 30 unhappy years in which they were looking for a new role, NATO is in the glorious position of having refound its old role.
Right. I also think there's some consequences, very negative consequences in the West from this invasion, and that is, in terms of the militarism and defense budgets of the US and of European countries that are already going up, I think that's a very negative consequence. There's also the impact on culture, in a sense. I mean, you see this growing culture of support for really, I think, disturbing support for censorship, where this idea that we have to, we shouldn't even be allowed to find Russian media to even see what their officials are saying. I think that's a really dangerous mindset to have. I think in a war, we need to be able to hear from all sides, even if we don't agree with them. And if you're only hearing from your side, you actually start to become deluded by your own side's propaganda. But what do you think will be the negative consequences on Europe, America, in terms of their defense budgets and just in terms of the sort of like damage it does to society to have this kind of war hysteria?
Well, it does remind me in certain respects, I was in America at the time of 9/11, and the hysteria that followed that, and of course the disasters that this led to. I think there is a real danger of that. And yes, I mean the McCarthyite hysteria and accusations of treason are terrible for culture. There's one additional thing that we haven't talked about. My last book was actually on climate change. And as the Secretary General of the United Nations said yesterday, this war and this crisis are a disaster for action against climate change because climate change has been totally wiped out from all the Western media. But secondly, of course, there is this mad rush back into subsidizing domestic fossil fuels, which means, of course, above all, coal for energy security and to keep prices low. And after all this talk of climate change being the existential threat, before this war, I was one of a tiny minority of people who was saying, look, in thinking about all this and in thinking about the need for a compromise over Ukraine, we've also got to think about the threat of climate change, which in the long run is a threat to the whole of humanity, which dwarfs what's happening in Ukraine. But, there was a very cruel remark about a US president in the past that he was so dumb that he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. It does seem to me that the US establishment, but Europeans as well to a great extent, are incapable of thinking of two things at the same time. One thing, simply seizes their minds, and then they become obsessed with it until something else comes along.
Right. And the other issue too, I mean, I'm glad I was actually going to ask you about the issue of climate change, so I'm glad you got to that. And I just have a couple more things I want to get to here. I know I've taken a lot of your time, but one of the other, I think, consequences of this as well is, many of us, not just on the left, but in general, I think we're skeptical of the US confidence that Russia was going to invade Ukraine on this day at this time. And that was for a reason. And a lot of that had to do with the big lie of the Iraq War. That was like the original sin, right, of the last 20 years. And this, the US being right on Russia invading, the US intelligence being right, seems to have restored a kind of blind faith in US intelligence. I mean, there already was a kind of blind faith of of US intelligence, generally speaking, but there was still that little bit of skepticism people had because of the Iraq War, and that seems to be completely gone now. And it's at this point, US intelligence could just say whatever they want, and there would be almost, I think, no voice, at least in the mainstream, really speaking out against it or saying, wait a second, like, let's get evidence first. So I think we're going to be dealing with the consequences of this for many years to come on so many levels. But I wanted to, just say that you and some of your colleagues at the Quincy Institutes are a voice, I think, of reason on a lot of issues related to war. I mean, Quincy Institute basically came into being to advocate against endless wars. And then here we are having another one. And at this point, a lot of you seem to be drowned out by the trumpets of war blown by, I think, most every think tank and mainstream media outlet right now. So why do you think it is that, the think tank world and the White House press pool, we've all seen these videos, from the intercept of the White House press pool, just like asking, why aren't you going to war harder? You almost go, start to feel bad for Joe Biden and Jen Psaki. But why do you think the think tank world and the White House press pool are so passionate about escalating this war? Why is war such a popular option in Washington? And I know there's not like one simple answer to that, but if you had to condense your reasoning for why that is, please go ahead.
Self-righteousness is a wonderful emotion, one of the most powerful and emotionally comforting emotions there are. I think the warming impact of self-righteousness has been much neglected, as a psychological factor. It's well, I won't get into what it's the equivalent of, but I think people just do become obsessed with these moral fervors, and then of course once which is rarely absent, humanity in general, but especially in Washington, careers come into it as well. There are obvious career in circumstances of general moral hysteria. There are obvious career advantages to being even more hysterical than everybody else. So you get a competition there. And then the fact in the think tanks, but also not many, but a few leading journalists have actually moved into the well, for the journalists it's access, but also access and career, and sometimes official career as well, if you look at Strobe Talbot. I worked for a mainstream think tank, two in fact, for several years in Washington, and the great majority of my American colleagues were clearly, everything that they said and did was tailored to calculating their chances of whether this would help or harm their chances to become chief assistant to the deputy chief assistant dog washer in the next administration, but two. This was really critical. And of course, the point is that because of the way that money works in Washington as well, once you've had an official position, your income from consultancies shoots up. Once you've had a senior official position, your income from consultancies becomes very great indeed. And so there are tremendous pressures to conform, not to stand out, to go with the crowd, or even calculate how to get ahead of the crowd. And it makes dissent. Dissenters are not executed or imprisoned, but they are banished to very small magazines. I'm one of a small minority of people who've written both for The Nation, the left-wing magazine, and for The National Interest, which is a sort of realist magazine. And I always say politically, they only have one thing in common. Neither of them pay anything.
Well, there you have it. And I guess, lastly, I just want to get your take on this. How concerned are you about the prospects for a no-fly zone? Obviously, we've heard officials, including Joe Biden himself, say this is absolutely out of the question. But there does seem to be a certain, segments of the punditry and the, media that are demanding one, and that sort of is growing louder. Do you worry that that's a possible scenario that could play out, a no-fly zone, and why or why not?
I worry, but I think on the whole it won't happen because it would mean war with Russia. And I think that the Europeans are, not all of them, not the Poles of course, but the West Europeans are begging America not to do that. And of course, if you really spooked European publics, because they would be in the front line in a way that America is not, you might see the disintegration of the Western alliance and actually pressure from Germany and France to make peace in Ukraine. And then, of course, there is the sheer geographical issue. If Germany refuses to participate, it becomes much more difficult. If Germany refuses to allow American planes to fly over Germany, it does actually become logistically quite difficult to mount such an operation. But as far as all the pressure for it is concerned, I think a lot of it is precisely because the people doing the pressuring know that it's not going to happen. And so, they can present themselves as tough guys and tremendous heroes. And of course, the Republicans can use it against the Biden administration in the serene knowledge that it's never going to happen. But I think, what you will get is bigger supplies of other weapons in consequence, drones, for example. So in other words, from a Ukrainian point of view, by really pushing this, they can also put pressure on the Biden administration to give them, more of other things.
And that's the real intention behind it. Well, Anatol Lieven, I want to thank you for joining me for the hour and giving us your expertise and points of view. Very quickly, where can people follow your analysis on this and other issues?
The Quincy Institute website, quincyinst.org, prints a lot of my stuff, and yeah, that's the best place to find me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure.